Welcome everyone to Methodist Central Hall in Manchester. My name is Reverend Ian Rutherford and I am the City Centre Minister here. At Central Hall we are a hub for social justice, a centre for mission and service, and a place for public theology at the heart of the city with a heart for the city. The founder of Methodism, John Wesley, opened the first Methodist church on this site in 1781. At the time, he noted that the chapel was too far into the countryside. We're not sure what he would make of the busyness of Manchester city centre and Oldham Street today. In 1886, Methodist Central Hall Manchester was opened as the first of the Central Hall models in the UK. This is the model that we continue to operate today, an open, accessible, and safe space for the whole community of Greater Manchester. In 1941, during the Second World War, we took a direct hit from a bomb, devastating 2/3 of this building. Well, we've lost some of the grandeur, but the committee at the time saw it as an opportunity for change, development, and repurposing. And so, to 2025, we're looking again at a major redevelopment for a new era here. We're going to continue to serve the city and the city region from this place. We were so delighted to be asked to host this Theos lecture tonight and to have our Mayor of Greater Manchester as the speaker. And it's my real pleasure to introduce to you the Director of Theos, Chinny MacDonald. Please welcome her.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. As was said, my name is Chinny MacDonald, and I have the great privilege of being Director of Theos. We're so delighted to have you join us for this, which is our 18th annual lecture, and the very first time that we have held it outside London. Yes, well done us. So thank you so much for the warm Mancunian welcome, and thanks also to our sponsors, CCLA. If you're not familiar with who we are, Theos is a religion and society think tank, which has been going for around 20 years. And we exist to make the case for the role of faith and religion in all aspects of public life. And we do that through, we believe, compelling research on a range of issues, from social cohesion to AI to polarization, to the changing nature of work, to motherhood, to death. And we tell these stories through media commentary and podcasts, animations, events, and more. Just a few practical things before we get to the main reason we are all here. First of all, fire exits. Take a look around and find your nearest ones. If there is an evacuation, follow the team's directions. There's no fire drill planned for this evening. We have a photographer tonight. If you'd prefer not to be photographed, just let him know or let one of the Theos team know. Theos team are wearing these badges. And bear with me, but to capture your audience questions anytime from now and during the Q&A later on, we're going to be using something called Mentimeter throughout the evening. You'll have all received a leaflet when you arrived, and this has a QR code for our Q&A session. So if you want to ask the Mayor a question at any point throughout his lecture, you just need to scan the QR code and follow the instructions. If you've got an old phone, or if you have any difficulties scanning the code, you can still join by visiting menti.com and typing in the code, which is on the leaflet, which is 82808664. Now, if you really can't work any of that out, or are not having any luck with your phone, then you have my permission to turn to your neighbour and ask them to post a question for you. We've heard that Northerners are friendly and like talking to each other, so you can do that. If you like, you can add your name to your question so we can point you out if your questions get picked, or you can write them anonymously. So at Theos, we spend a lot of time thinking about what faith means in public life, how it shapes the communities we live in, how it can bring people together, and how it can help us respond to division. So tonight's lecture is part of that conversation, thinking about how we create stronger, more compassionate communities. And so I am really delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester. Andy has been a tireless advocate for this city and its people, working for fairness, dignity, and opportunity for all. Before being elected, Andy held ministerial positions at the Home Office, Department of Health, and the Treasury. In 2008, he became Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport before returning to Health as Secretary of State in 2009. But here in Manchester, he's become known for really fighting for the city and its communities, the kind of leadership that matters at moments like the challenging one we find ourselves in at this time. Andy will speak to us for about 30 minutes. We'll then hear a few words from my colleague, Dr. Nick Spencer, who is our Senior Fellow at Theos, and he'll reflect on Andy's words before we move into a time of Q&A. But for now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Andy Burnham.
Thank you so much, everyone. I thought I'd better set my stopwatch timer so I don't go over time. And I should apologise to you all for the slightly late start, but it's with good reason. And this is some breaking news for the residents of Greater Manchester. The bus strikes are off this weekend, so you can probably see us a bit of a relief as I stand before you all tonight. It's lovely to be with you all, and it's nice to be in the spotlight, because you may have noticed I've been keeping something of a low profile recently, so nice to have a bit of attention. For someone whose journey has taken me from altar boy to mayor and cabinet minister in between, I can honestly say it is a genuine honour, privilege indeed, to be asked to give this prestigious lecture for the first time outside of London. I like to chalk up those type of firsts, and what it gives me in this difficult moment, as Jean said, is an opportunity to lead our city region in the process of reflection following the devastating events of Thursday, the 2nd of October, at the Heaton Park Synagogue, where we lost two of our friends and neighbours, Adrian Dolby and Melvin Kravitz, many others injured, traumatised by what happened, and obviously a community some 3 miles from here and across Greater Manchester still grieving in the aftermath of that appalling attack. So I didn't feel there was any other way to start this evening than to have a moment of silence and reflection. And I wonder, ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to stand to observe that with me. Thank you so much, everybody. Obviously, I'm sure we all tonight send our heartfelt feelings to our friends and neighbours in our Jewish community here in Greater Manchester, but everybody who's struggling with the times that we're living in, because they are difficult times. And I wanted to begin to sketch out to you this evening a meaningful response to those times, not a simplistic solution, not sort of the usual sort of politician type initiative, but something deeper that answers the times that we're in. And the title I've given this lecture this evening is this: From a Crisis of Trust to a Culture of Encounter. From a crisis of trust to a culture of encounter. I think we are living in times where there is a crisis of trust in terms of whether people can believe what they're hearing, or whether they, if you like, go to something they trust but actually may not be factual. There is a crisis of who to believe in the times in which we live. But how do you move from where we are right now to something more positive, something that Pope Francis called a culture of encounter? And that's what I want to sort of sketch out tonight, to see if we can move from one to the other. As I say, I'm not coming with a simplistic analysis, because it's not possible to know what, if anything, could have prevented what happened last Thursday. But I think it is possible to begin a deeper reflection as to how we build in our communities a level of connection that might minimize the likelihood of it happening again in the future, to build that culture of encounter once again in our communities. So I'm going to begin with something that is a reflection on 25 years in frontline politics, because that is what I'm in, my 25th year. I was first elected in 2001 in my home area of Leigh to be a Member of Parliament. And this, the 25th year of my frontline service, has actually proven to be unlike any of the other 24. It has been marked by an increasing number of very challenging encounters when I've been out and about, with accusations made which don't bear much relationship to the facts as I understand them, and a conversation that is lacking connection because of the lack of a shared basis of what we would believe to be common facts. And that has worried me all year, and it's a change I've felt personally this year. The phenomenon of people, if you like, having alternative fact bases seems to have been exacerbated by the pandemic, when a loss of trust in official statements and policies seemed to lead people to go into different directions. And perhaps the algorithms of social media drew them into those places. But it feels like it lingers, and it feels like it's a real problem that people now look to alternative theories. They look to double down on what they believe rather than thinking about another point of view. And that is the times that we have to negotiate. It's the hallmark of the times that we're in. So what do we do as we come to the end of the first quarter of this century? Because that is where we find ourselves. And there is this crisis of trust in the old sources of information, the established way of doing things, in the top-down structures of our society. The world has become more complex in those last 25 years, but the way we run things has not. It's in many ways the same as it was in the last century. And we're trying to run things in this one, not kind of realizing how much has changed. And this is creating a big disconnect, I think, between people and politics, between government of all kinds and everybody else. And perhaps it explains why people have lost trust in the ability of politics to fix things. And one thing which I think is at the heart of this problem and has hugely exacerbated it is the demise of the local agency and local action. Over the last 15 years, the power of local government has massively diminished. Now, why is that such a problem that we need to confront ourselves with this evening? The received wisdom in my old world, where I used to work, Westminster, would be that people don't care much about councils and council funding. They only care about the NHS and other services at that level. But I think it turns out, actually, 15 years on, that they care very much, because if people walk out of their front door every day and can only see potholes or overgrown parks, it builds a feeling in people that things can't be fixed. It kind of creates a sort of a pessimism that kind of sinks into the kind of community. It's not just the inconvenience of those things being there, it's a sense that the fabric can't be maintained anymore. That simple things are unaffordable. And then there's a sort of despair, I think, that kind of comes out of that. And that lack of agency at a local level and belief that people elected to do something can do something when in fact they're telling us they can't. I think that starts to build an alienation at the local, very local level, and a despair, really, that makes people perhaps look to the extremes for solutions. And I think this is becoming a really serious problem for us, that the agency of communities is so low now that people can't have an ambition that things can get better. And it's danger of settling in and becoming a sort of pervasive, permanent feeling. One thing that I reflect on as well, though, is kind of how, if I look at things from a different angle as Mayor of Greater Manchester, when I look at how the state nationally still tries to provide services, it does so in a very top-down, quite soulless way in terms of the way it tries to deal with things. So, for instance, if you look at the benefits system is a top-down, soulless, tick-box system, a computer says no approach, that hammers the hope out of people at times. And it can be a system that the residents here in Greater Manchester, and I hear it wherever I go, fear having any interaction with. So if that's the situation, how can that system sort of move people forward? How can that start to kind of give us all a sense of forward direction? In fact, I would say it often makes things worse. I look at another way in which Whitehall does things in terms of a very topical debate right now, asylum and migration. The Home Office spends thousands, billions of pounds procuring accommodation through outsourced entities that don't have any communication with the local communities in terms of procuring that accommodation. But as we learned in the news this week, are making millions of pounds of profits out of that system, but are providing very poor standard accommodation, inedible food, for the people meant to be in their care. And you ask yourself, how can that be? How can that be a good way of running things? Surely there's a better way of running things than that. Actually, if you work from the bottom up with communities, wouldn't we come up with a much more humane solution to that way of doing things? I go back as also to the pandemic. Do you remember NHS Test and Trace? This is another example of the kind of culture that I'm kind of complaining about, where Whitehall just goes to these big corporate entities and says, provide this service for us. And in the pandemic, Test and Trace was another example of that, where, again, billions were spent on a contact tracing service, which here in Greater Manchester made barely any difference to the spread of the virus. And that was because they operated another tick box system through call centres where nobody answered the phone to an anonymous number. And we had spent the pandemic saying, if you route that money through local communities, through people knocking on doors, for a fraction of the cost, you will get a much bigger benefit. But would they listen? No, they wouldn't. And actually, this is not a political point. This is the way all governments have done it for a long period of time. This style of top-down delivery that actually doesn't reach people, and if anything, makes the matter worse. And I kind of have a kind of unique vantage point on all of this, having been a government minister where civil servants used to ask me to do those things and sign off those contracts. And now having had almost a decade as Mayor of Greater Manchester, where I've looked at the world from the bottom up back at Whitehall, and I've seen just how wrong it is, the kind of way we're doing things, a complete loss of agency and, if you like, ambition at the local level, while we're just sort of losing people with these soulless services that don't kind of reach they don't reach into people's lives, they don't connect with people. And we've kind of found ourselves, I think, in a very unsatisfactory place. We've got a hollowed out local state combined with soulless top-down provision that is becoming, in my view, quite a toxic combination. Citizens don't trust it to change their lives. So what do we do about that? And it's why I'm coming to what I want to propose to you tonight in terms of what I think the solution looks like after the time that I've kind of spent in this job. As I say, it's not a simplistic solution. It's the product of quite deep thought in terms of the sea change that we need, the paradigm shift we need in Britain to make it feel like it's functioning again. It's working for people again. It's caring for communities again in a way it just hasn't been for quite a while now. And to me, it's replacing the soulless with a new vision for the local state, with trust, community, faith, belief, connection at its heart. That is what I feel we now have to build if we're to build back in a way that is going to give us some chance of answering the really big challenges we face in our times. And to be honest with you, it's such a change from where the British state has been. Let me give you an example from when I was Health Secretary in 2010. That was a time when the first efficiencies were being brought, cuts were being brought to ministers, recognising at that point we were going to have to kind of change some of the way in which we were providing public services. And as Secretary for Health, I was given the first list of the cuts that the Department for Health wanted to make. And what was number one on the list? Now, I'm sure you could think of things that you think are wasteful spending in terms of the NHS. But I tell you what they put right in front of me, number one, as though it was the easiest thing to do. The hospital chaplaincy service was number one on the list. And I said, no, no way. Why, Minister? I said, because when my grandmother was in hospital in the last days of her life, and we arrived to see her, and she said, has he been yet? She wasn't talking about the doctor. She was talking about the priest. That mattered 1,000,000 times more to Kitty Murray than whether or not the doctor had been. That was everything to her. And for me, it was a moment when I kind of said no to them, and they kept trying to persuade me that it was the cut that we should make. That the state really had no sight of the spiritual. And it, in many ways, pushed it to the margins. It didn't want to deal with it at all. It kind of almost saw it as a danger to even import that into the way services should be provided, should be excluded in its view. And it kind of led me to start thinking differently about things. To me, if you don't start with the person, with names, not numbers, you have no chance. And you've got to kind of see people's health as a combination, not just of physical, social, and mental, but spiritual too. And if you miss that, you're missing what matters to people. Therefore, you're never going to connect with people in the way that things are done. And I always remember that conversation in the Department of Health when later in the pandemic, working here in Greater Manchester, I heard something very different being put to me by people on the ground in communities as opposed to working in those Whitehall departments. In the middle of the pandemic, it would have been the summer of 2020, we were worried about vaccination, and we couldn't reach some of the communities that we knew we had to sort of really boost the uptake. And it was at that point, I remember somebody saying in one of our meetings, well, we must now go to the places of worship and see if they will open up and become vaccination centres. And it was revelatory, because when we did start to ask for their support, the vaccination rate started to change. And the learning for me there was, if you deliver through places and people that are trusted, you've then got a chance to make a difference. If you just keep thinking in the old way of doing things, we're going to fail more and more people and miss the connection with them. So for me, I've taken all of that journey and all of that learning and come to a point where I believe we need to completely rebuild the local state. And that money that is currently going out into these corporate entities, ticking those boxes and raking in a lot of millions, I believe the devolution journey that Greater Manchester has been on has hit a point where we're ready to say to the national state, you need to rethink here and do things in a very different way. We have levels of distrust and alienation in our communities that can't really be allowed to carry on. The level of disrepair in our communities, the lack of agency in local government is a real and present danger to us all. That sense that communities can't improve themselves is something we cannot allow to continue. So what we have put forward to the government is the notion of a more positive way of thinking about support. We call it Live Well, a new Live Well service across the whole of Greater Manchester, where we would take the money that is currently making little difference and we reroute it from the bottom up through our community organisations, our voluntary organisations, our social enterprises, and yes, our faith-based organisations, because we know these are the organisations that are rooted in our communities, and they operate out of spaces that people know, and the people in those places are people they trust, and that gives you the connection that makes change possible, positive things able to happen. And that is an idea that we're bringing forward. Do you know what it makes possible? It makes possible that culture of encounter that I spoke about before, real connection in communities. This is what Pope Francis's his theory was described as a societal approach that prioritizes direct, compassionate interaction and relationships over indifference and judgment. Indifference and judgment is often what people feel they get from those top-down services. Imagine a state that could prioritize direct, compassionate interaction. Imagine a state that could take a names, not numbers approach and work with the person right in front of them as an individual person and deal with the thing that is most weighing them down in their life and lift that off their shoulders. Imagine if we had a state that could do that. Imagine, rather than making our faith-based organizations, our community and voluntary organizations constantly scrabble for funding, imagine if they had the feeling of core funding coming through to sustain them ongoing. It would be like drops of rain on barren soil, wouldn't it, for a kind of a sector that is crying out for that kind of support. Imagine what would flourish if they had that kind of nourishment. It would be unbelievable. But what you would be doing is that funding coming through those community organizations would have so many circular benefits in terms of the volunteers it would support, the connection it would build, the change it would produce in our communities. And I think to succeed, Live Well will have to be a very individual offer, going right to the heart of what someone's problem is. Often the DWP will only think about, if you're not in work, here's a training course and you've got to go on that and you've got to kind of complete it and then you can get your benefits. Well, actually, it's probably something else that's stopping them from moving forward. The housing situation that they have most likely, or the debt that they've got as a millstone around their neck that means every waking moment of their life is consumed with fear of the letterbox going or the knock at the door. Until you lift that off somebody, they're not going to be able to then breathe and move forward. So imagine if you had a service, a Live Well service, where community organizations and others were funded every day to provide that individual help to people. And yes, move them towards work so that in the end we save money in the benefit system. That's what it would do, and that's what we believe in Greater Manchester Live Well will do. It will achieve better results than have ever been achieved by the national system. But I think there has to be a communal offer as well. And this brings me back again to that culture of encounter. How we provide services in communities that bring people from different communities perhaps into the same room, people from different backgrounds into the same room, and have a dialogue perhaps that they're not having at this moment in time. How can we create a new culture where people are not doubling down on their own opinions and spending all night on a screen and an algorithm that's making them even more firmly of that view? How do you get them in a room where they may have a conversation with somebody that changes their perspective? You know what used to happen in life that doesn't seem to happen so much anymore? I've had the privilege of being in the company of some of the organisations in Greater Manchester that provide men's mental health support. Maybe some of you have heard of Andy's Man Club. But we also have a very local charity here in the name of a firefighter who took his own life, the Jamie Horrocks Trust, and it operates around Cadishead and Earlham. And they invited me down once to the Lads' Den, which is a similar service to what Andy's Man Club provide. And it was such a humbling thing to be in the room and see people from genuinely all walks of life from the community walk into that room, some in overalls, some in high-vis, a fellow in a suit, just all walking into this room and beginning a conversation with each other that they would not be able to have at home. They certainly wouldn't have in a clinical setting. It was the most beautiful expression of the culture of encounter that you could possibly imagine. And you probably don't think those conversations are happening these days, but they can do, and they are happening. But how do you really build it in to everyday life once again? And we start to find a real answer to the alienation that we have in our communities, the distrust of everything, the belief that nothing can change for people or places. Well, I feel Greater Manchester is proving that it can change. So we're a decade into devolution. We've done things like we've put our public transport system back under public control. We've called off the bus strikes. That's a good thing. We have got a level of growth in our city region that I don't think people would have thought was possible. Certainly in my youth growing up here, things were closing. To get on in life, I had to go south in the early 1990s, as many people of my generation did. But look at us today, the fastest growing city region in the UK. We didn't think that would be the case, did we, if we go back 20 years? But that's what we are right now. You know, look at the city and where it's at. So we have done things here that probably people didn't think were possible. But I would say now is the time to take on the biggest challenge of all, which is to rebuild the British state from the bottom up and run things in a very different way, in a Greater Manchester way, that's about people and connection and faith and trust, and kind of build back up from there and break out of this model that we've kind of been trying to run in different ways under all of the political parties, because they're all to blame in one way or another. Well, let me just be clear about that. They are, all of them, including the government I was in. But kind of build up through communities in a different way. Trust communities again. That's what we believe here in Greater Manchester. And I'm proud, Reverend Ian Rutherford, who you heard from at the start this evening, who chairs our faith and belief panel, alongside other panels that we have, because we have all voices in the room. When I came in as mayor, he opened the doors of this place to our Homelessness Action Network. And he started to say to me, build from the bottom up, and then build a network of networks and build more and more people in the room shaping the devolution that you've got. Do it with people. Build it up. And you know, by doing that, we began to make a difference and we began to build out the power. If you use power in that way, you get so much more return than if you use it in a way where you just drop it on people and you tell people what to do. So this is what I mean by moving from a crisis of trust to a culture of encounter. We believe Greater Manchester can bring forward a vision for a new local state that is based on a very different way of running things. I can't see an alternative, given where we are right now, other than going back to trusting in people and trusting in communities and letting people begin to solve the challenges that we've got in society. I do know this: we can't carry on as we are. We're going too far down a path that is becoming too dark and too dangerous for everyone. I absolutely am as patriotic as anybody in this room. I believe in this country. I believe in its people. I believe in what it's always stood for. But actually, I feel some of that is currently in the balance. It's kind of becoming at risk. And I'm not sure what world my kids will be living in 10 or 20 years from now. I think there is a lot at stake right now. And my message from here tonight, giving this lecture, is to my former colleagues in Westminster to say, business as usual is finished. You need to rebuild with people from the bottom up. You need to trust people again. You need to trust communities. You need to repair the damage in our communities. You need to give devolution its chance to come up with a better way of running things. We believe we're proving that in Greater Manchester. I thank you all for listening to this lecture this evening, and I would say to you all, keep hopeful, stay strong, take every opportunity that you have to build that culture of encounter. We all must do that in the times in which we are living. Give hope to other people every single day, and let's see if we can turn things around. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Wow. That was quite something. And it resonated enormously powerfully with me, and I think with many people here today. From a crisis of trust to a culture of encounter. You talked about trust and community and faith and belief and connection, which has obsessed us at Theos for the last 20 or so years, and has often felt as if in dire need in our society. And in particular, you'll talk about agency and the idea of the person having a physical, social, mental, and a spiritual dimension. What you said about your grandma and the hospital chaplain resonated. One of the earliest pieces of work we did was a freedom of information request from health authorities looking at their intended spending cuts for chaplaincy, and time again. Chaplaincy was seen as the soft underbelly and an easy cut, when we knew for so many people it meant so much. I want to try in the few minutes I have to bring some of those thoughts into perspective of what Theos has been doing for the last 20 or so years. As many of you know, we were scheduled to be launched in November 2006. And then by some quirk of divine humour, The God Delusion was published the month before. Thanks for that, boss. And that meant that the waters into which we were launched were very, very choppy. We don't really like talking about religion and politics very much anyway, but at that particular time, we particularly didn't like talking about it. But I think we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about both for the reasons you've outlined. Little vignettes appropriate to Manchester. And one of my heroes is William Temple, who was Bishop of Manchester in the 1920s. And when he was Bishop of Manchester, he delivered a series of lectures in which he coined, for the first time in English, a phrase we use all the time. He talked about the need for the state to be a welfare state. And that got picked up and developed by his good friend, William Beveridge, and it became the basis of the post-war welfare settlement. Beveridge and Temple were close allies, and even though at that stage Temple was Archbishop of Canterbury, so he couldn't get too political, it was clear that he supported the idea of the state intervening and helping in that way. And that's part of a wider story of the way in which the churches and Christian thought had constantly in this country said the state has a responsibility. The first ever proposal for national insurance came from a clergyman, William Blakely, in the 1880s. Appropriate to this building, it was a Liberal government in 1906 that was brought into power by non-conformist MPs that finally launched national insurance. A generation later, we have the welfare state, so keenly supported by the churches. A generation after that, we had Faith in the City, the commission organised by Robert Runcie, which questioned the policies of the Thatcher government, whose report we are marking the 40th anniversary of this month, questioning the policies of the Thatcher government in the impact it had on the poorest people. Time and time and time again, the Christian refrain has been, if we claim to live in a Christian country, a Christian state, whatever that might mean, the state has a responsibility for people. But, and this is so close to our hearts at Theos, it can't simply be top-down. We remember that in the Beveridge report, it talked about 5 giants, which could have come out of John Bunyan: idleness, ignorance, disease, squalor, want. The Beveridge report didn't talk about loneliness, didn't talk about anxiety, it didn't talk about depression. And yet, if you were to speak to any GP today, you would say that a sizable number of people who find themselves in their surgery do not have anything clinically wrong with them, but are lonely or anxious or depressed. They need relationships, they need support, they need purpose, they need community around them. My colleague Marianne Rosario did a project a couple of years ago on social prescribing, the idea that what GPs should do is not write a chitty for the latest drug that will line the pockets of the drug company, but advise people to join a local community group, a choir, a gardening group, whatever it might be. Because it's that support in the community that will make a transformative difference. We did a piece of work about 10 years ago, sadly still very appropriate, talking about making multiculturalism work, which tried to observe the fact that, yes, people do fundamentally believe different things. And sometimes we have violently different views about international affairs. But everybody, irrespective of what their creed, wants their local park to be safe, wants their local school to perform well, wants to make sure that people who are addicted on the streets are no longer addicted and no longer on their streets. That kind of side-by-side community activity, that's the thing that makes multiculturalism work. My colleague George has just published a report on welcoming the stranger, and you can get copies of all these reports out, about how, I'm conscious this isn't the most popular thing to say in certain quarters at the moment, I think there is an ethical duty to welcome people who have suffered appalling hardships. And so often it is the churches that are doing that in creative ways. George's report talks about how certain churches have turned over their kitchens, not to feed the people who are waiting on their asylum claims being processed, but to allow those people to feed others. Because food is so important in the cultures from which they come, and the ability to feed and cook and provide for others and to say thank you was an enormously humanizing activity. That is bottom-up activity. And we need that just as much as top-down activity. Indeed, without the bottom-up activity, the top-down activity becomes telling people to do things and then giving them a list and then making sure they tick the boxes, which isn't what a community, isn't what a society is about. I think that balance between the top-down and the bottom-up is a mark of integrity, and I think that is the way that, as you talked about, Andy, we build trust. But we don't do it through edict, and we don't do it through policy, and we don't do it through legislation, important as all those things are, but we do it through those human encounters. So I get quite passionate about this, absolutely countersigning everything you said, and thank you for sharing it with us.
I think Nick's just given a better version of my speech, so brilliant though, wasn't it? Fantastic.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and I'm going to give you time now to use the Mentimeter. The instructions, I think, are behind me as well. I'd love to get to your questions, but I will start with my first one, which is, how are you? I'm sure the past week has been, or the past weeks and the past week have been very difficult for the city, for Greater Manchester, but also for you personally, feeling a sense of weight of responsibility. How are you? Do you get any sleep?
It's kind of you to ask. Thank you. I'm okay. I'm bearing up. It is moments like this that do, if you like, you kind of feel your batteries going right down, and it has been a little like that But it's a moment when you have to provide that sort of, you have to step forward, don't you, in a moment like this. It's the job. It's why I do it. And what always gives me strength is this place of Greater Manchester. It's always there for people. Sometimes we think the world's getting very dark. If you only live on your screen, you'd probably think, oh my goodness, but when you actually have the privilege of my job in meeting people in all of our different communities, you get supported by people in so many ways, and yeah, they keep me strong, and I'm good, thank you. I'm bearing up all right.
Well, one thing that we've noticed, I think, in the past few months of working towards today and talking to many of the people that live here, is that sense of people and connection that you talked about, and particularly among the faith communities and the faith groups and their kind of faith and belief forums and the interfaith conversations. What difference do you think that has made in this week? Has it been a challenge to that? Has it been a threat to that? Or has it, because of the relationships that there already were, has that been a strength?
No, it's a strength. It's always a strength, and they know who they are. It's not just Ian, who I mentioned. It's everybody. There's a lot of people in the audience. They re-educated me when I arrived here, fresh from Westminster a number of years ago, and it's something that, in the end, I've kind of this is Greater Manchester's superpower, this connection between people, communities. And although it's been difficult for sure in the last few days, certainly at the vigil on Friday, there were people from all Greater Manchester communities there. The Muslim community were represented there. And it took me back to May the 22nd, 2017, when I was 2 weeks elected as Mayor of Greater Manchester. I think, it's still there. The heart of this place is what makes it incredible. And it carries us through moments that we're in right now. I think there've been a number of events across the city region today in terms of acts of reflection and remembrance, and that is what characterises Greater Manchester, I guess.
One of the things that really came through in your lecture was this idea that business as usual won't cut it anymore. It won't be able to deal with the challenges that we're facing as a nation. We at Theos did some polling with YouGov around kind of trust in local communities a few weeks ago. One of the things that we found was that Reform voters are less likely to trust mainstream media, more likely to trust social media. And you talked about some of the challenges of the algorithm and social media. What do you think should be the strategy in reaching people? What do you think the government should do, or the Labour Party should do to reach them, if it's not in traditional ways?
So none of what I said was, blaming any voter of any party. When I left Westminster, I vowed to take a place-first approach rather than a party-first approach. And I don't blame anyone who's feeling despondent about the way things is and is kind of looking to other parties, because they've almost been pushed there, haven't they, by, I would say, business as usual has pushed them there, because they look at it and think, this really isn't working. And I don't blame them for saying that. It isn't working. But what I would say is, it's that very basic thing about places functioning properly and having some pride back in communities and some agency back at the very local level. We've kind of lived through a time where it looks like politics can't even fix the simple things anymore, can't fix a pothole. And that is a real problem, actually, if you're living in a time where that is kind of what people begin to feel. Because then, understandably, they'll say, well, what can it fix if it can't fix that in front of my house? Or it can't fix, the street lamp that I kind of reported. And I do really kind of hold Westminster to blame here for cutting local government to the bone, but also failing to fix things that massively impact on local government. So it's never revalued council tax, for instance. So the kind of council tax is stuck in 1991 house prices. Are we therefore surprised that councils don't have enough money to meet their statutory responsibilities? And then you come to the biggest of their statutory responsibilities, social care. It's appalling, is it not, that this country has over 3 decades plus now completely failed to face up to one of the biggest issues of our time, and has kind of left it floundering in all of that period of time. That is the Westminster culture that ultimately I rejected, because I tried to reform social care as Health Secretary. You might remember that. You may not have agreed necessarily with what I put forward. I kind of put forward a plan that was based on everyone making a contribution, but then everyone being covered for all of their lifetime care costs. But, you know, I look at it now, and I'm at a position where my dad has got Alzheimer's, and I've lived with my mum through a care system that is still giving out care in 15-minute slots. Now, that's that top-down thing that I was talking to you about before, you know, like the 10-minute with the GP, or, you know, that cannot cope. That system will never deal with the complexity of all of our lives now. And yet, they've left this malnourished, broken system trying to care for very vulnerable people. In my mum's case, we learned that actually the 15-minute visit was okay when my dad had moderate needs, but the minute they went to severe needs, it unleashed chaos in her kind of daily life. And the really kind of mind-blowing thing is almost like me and my brothers have to work hard to keep my dad out of hospital, because everyone's trying to ring 999 because they're told to do that. The minute they can't cope with the situation, you're kind of almost taking people into the hospital to the most expensive end of the system. Now, how do we make sense of that as a country where everyone has said for 3 decades social care should be fixed? Westminster completely fails to fix it. Local authorities are left now just overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge. You see the point I'm making? I just think we've just allowed things to fall into a serious state of disrepair. And I personally think, having switched from national government to local government, it's the failure of national government to prioritize the local, you know, the personal, the place. And that is becoming, you know, a major part now of our loss, our crisis of trust, as I described it at the start. So, yeah, I really kind of, you know, I've been outspoken in recent weeks, as you may have seen, but I'm in this, I've kind of been too long in politics to kind of just speak in code anymore. I think too much is too badly broken not to speak out in a more direct way. And some people don't like it, but I'm not going to stop doing it.
Okay, it might be time for my cheeky question, which is okay. So why don't you go back to Westminster and fix it?
I was so glad to leave, and I've been so energized in this role. And I do think what we're doing here, honestly, is a big part of the solution. A state that is a shared endeavor between public, private, voluntary, faith, community. That is the answer, it seems to me. You know, dare I say it, David Cameron was onto something with the big society. He just didn't fund it. But if you fund it properly, it actually could be a really better way of doing things and making it all add up and making the money work in a way that's affordable to the country. Actually, there was something really valuable there. So what I'm kind of trying to build in Greater Manchester through Live Well and everything we're trying to do here, in my view, is a big part of the answer. I'm not trying to avoid your question. I've not ruled out going back, but I don't know, does it want the level of change that I'm suggesting? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think you have to change the culture of politics completely, because the style of politics down there is part of your problem. Party first, point scoring first. That is a big part of your problem. Look how they've point scored over social care. They did it to me, they called it a death tax. They did it to Theresa May, they called it a dementia tax. How do you make substantial social change when you get that sort of point scoring, simplistic criticism that then the newspapers tear it to pieces, and then that's it. And then you can't move something as important as that forward because of that culture. I don't know if they want what I'm saying. I've started to talk about a political approach where we remove the whip system from MPs. Let MPs be true to their place first and call what's right for what they believe in, rather than being told how to vote and taking a line to take in an interview. You know what I learned after 16 years in Westminster? That it actually makes a fraud out of good people, because it makes you vote in ways you don't believe because they twist your arm to do it. And it makes you say things in TV studios that you come out and say, I'm not sure I felt comfortable with that. And you realize the longer you're there that people lose a sense of who you are because you're doing all of that stuff. That's the problem with our national politics. It's not actually based on connection and authenticity. It's based on a sort of, there's a phoniness at the heart of our national political system. And if I was to go back to answer your question, it would absolutely be to fundamentally change it. I would bring in proportional representation, because I think more collaboration between the parties is actually an important thing. Have longer term solutions to fix things based on collaboration, rather than this idea that one party is going to uniquely fix everything and then that's going to last forever. Well, life's too complicated now. So I've given you a long answer here, but I honestly don't know whether they want the level of change that I'm advocating. I think the whole thing needs huge upheaval, and you need to almost build a political system from the local up to the national that is based more on place first rather than party first. And there are too many people in the system who would fight that quite vehemently because they're stuck in that old way of thinking.
Thank you. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about faith and religion as it shows up in public life. And you talked about, and Nick talked about, basically the past 20, 25 years. If you go back 20 years, there was a lot of suspicion around kind of government political engagement with faith groups or funding of faith groups at a local level because of a fear of proselytization, wanting to convert people. Do you think that that has changed now? What's your approach here? Or do you see that same reticence in other places? Has it changed?
I don't think so. I think it's still the prevailing sort of feeling in Whitehall and Westminster. I think it is changing through devolution, because when you're the mayor of a great place like this, or my friend Steve in Liverpool, or some of the other mayors around, you kind of see it completely differently. Our faith-based communities are major assets for us. I'm going to come back to our faith and belief panel. They have been talking to us about, when things are challenging, when challenging events happen, can we have a situation where we can mobilize through all places of worship in the city region, common messaging about the need to support each other, reach out to other communities. And it's an amazing thing that Ian and his colleagues on our faith and belief panel have kind of put in place, a real system to get kind of in the, in the mix with us, really, in difficult times in Greater Manchester, as they did in 2017, did last week. You see it differently from our level, and I don't think it's changed at a national level. But we keep working to change it, and I keep saying, devolution is beginning to change the way this. We're kind of playing back a different way of doing things to Whitehall, and I think it's beginning to sort of chip away at the old way of thinking. But no, can I say to you that the current health secretary is not being presented with a plan to cut the hospital chaplaincy service? No, I can't, because my guess is he probably has been.
Well, you've spoken before about how Catholic social teaching has informed your politics. Yep. When you see J.D. Vance talking about Catholicism as it relates to an American First policy, how does that sit with your Catholicism?
Well, it doesn't in any way, shape or form. I could have given a more... did anyone else watch how he treated Zelensky in the Oval Office and not just want to kind of like, I know we shouldn't be advocating anything that's a bit... Anyway, but I just, no is the answer. I mean, I was told, there was a Greater Manchester MP called Paul Goggins, who we sadly lost. I don't know if anybody here anyone remember Paul? Oh, isn't that nice? Paul was massive in terms of my development early in Parliament, because Paul he knew what schools I'd been to, and he knew was, I have to admit it, born in Liverpool from Catholic background. He knew kind of what kind of person I was, and he kind of made a beeline for me when I got into Parliament, and he really mentored me, Paul. And I remember him early on in my time in Parliament sitting me down and saying, Andy, you will come across people who spend their entire time here seeking out other people with power so they can kind of get on a ladder and get some benefits from it and, have this sort of life and then plan their route out of politics. He said to me, the point of politics is to give your power to people with none. And for me, I remember hearing that and just thinking, right. And I saw him in terms of the causes he took up and the things that he did. And Paul and I used to talk about Catholic social teaching, the impact it had on us. And, I'll be honest, I've kind of come and gone a little bit on, and I found sometimes, back on your J.D. Vance point, I'll be honest with you, I found the kind of moralizing era in the Catholic Church under a previous pope very difficult, when all of the kind of attention was on quite a hard line on moral issues, and I didn't necessarily share that. And I found that quite a difficult thing, because I would often get letters from, the church in its many guises, and I would be, you must vote this way and you must do this, and often I didn't vote the way that they wanted. To me, it's why I kind of had the greatest privilege of my life going to the Vatican in 2023. We're any great friends here tonight, and we all remember that, don't we? It was an incredible moment of deep connection, and it was a great image of interfaith Greater Manchester, wasn't it, in St. Peter's Square. To me, Pope Francis spoke to what the Catholicism that I kind of remember from my upbringing. Archbishop Derek Warlock, who was a big influence in terms of that era that Nick was describing in the early 1980s. I was an altar boy. I used to have to press the button on his tape-recorded messages in the church. And to me, that kind of church that was always about speaking for people without power, those who needed to be built up, rather than others on the other side of the Atlantic sort of using the power of that pulpit to sort of give more power to those who've already got it. No, I don't go with that, and I don't like the way religion is kind of being played into that debate, as though the religion only belongs on that side of the argument rather than on the other side. So, yeah, I hope that's some sort of an answer to what you're saying. But the Catholic social teaching that I learned, I know this might be a controversial statement to some here, but I found what I was taught in church and then at school, my politics, in my view, are the kind of delivery of it in the real world. That's what I've always believed, and I've always traced my politics back to that upbringing.
Thank you. I'm surprised you didn't say you agreed with J.D. Vance, but so we have quite a few questions that have come in, and people can vote for the ones that they like. So I'm going to ask the kind of most popular ones. So the first one is from Sukhbir. Put your hand up. Who has said, Andy, thank you for your talk today. Why do politicians talk very little about faith or religion?
Well, I don't know if you're here, Sukhbir, but you are. Oh. Honestly, what an inspirational leader in our Sikh community this gentleman is. He definitely deserves a round of applause. the leader of Feed My City. We love you, Sutbeer. What was the question again?
Why don't politicians?
So does my mum.
Why don't politicians talk about religion?
I think it goes back to what I was saying, Sutbeer, about the Westminster culture. You know, it's not encouraged territory, really. And those that do, I don't know, some do, but it's kind of been territory that, you know, often isn't territory that people are kind of will feel comfortable walking into. As I say, the national political climate doesn't really support it. And that, I think, is to Parliament's great loss. If people talked about their own spiritual journey a bit more, I think it would connect with more voters than excluding that side of their life. You know, it was the old phrase I think Alistair Campbell used about "we don't do God." Well, that kind of is the norm in Westminster. Whichever God, you know, but that is kind of the way in which it works. And I think people don't do it because they fear if they do it, they'll be seen as they're a bit, you know, of the religious whatever. And that I'm afraid is that prevailing culture.
Great. This is a question from Alison. You may have heard about the research which shows that young people are turning to faith in large numbers. What do you think is happening in society that is contributing to this movement? And this was research done by the Bible Society, which is our parent organisation, called the Quiet Revival. So what do you think might be leading young people to be turning towards faith?
Because I think they're living in a time where what can they believe in? You know, it's hard to believe in what they see, isn't it? In their kind of screens washing over them. So I think a lot will be saying, well, what is there to sort of believe in? And actually, I'm going to be honest again, politics hasn't given them enough to believe in. And that, I think, possibly is turning more and more young people towards faith. And it gives you perhaps some hope, doesn't it, that people are still looking for kind of bigger things, better things to believe in. So, you know, that's a positive thing. But I do feel we need to get back to a society where they can believe in, obviously, in religion, religious leaders, but also political leaders as well. I think once we can give them the connection that they're looking for, then I think that's how we'll start to repair society.
So a question from Peter Green. Given some of the scenes we've seen outside of hotels accommodating asylum seekers, do you really believe that local communities will take up the challenge of providing accommodation for refugees?
Well, I mentioned that issue just because it's a really hugely worrying approach that we've got, where, you know, accommodation for very vulnerable people is being chosen by organisations that just don't consult with the people who know places and know how better to manage those things. But that is the situation that we've got. You know, people are placed in hotels or in other places with zero consultation with councils. And I just do not see how that is going to work for anybody. And there must be a better way of doing it. So it would be difficult, and I know there'd be reticence amongst some of our councils to take on that challenge, but that is how it used to be done. It was done in that way. If you go back, I think, to the 80s and early 90s, it was done like that. One thing I do know is, can we run it in the way that it's being run right now, where you kind of look at, you know, this sort of, the kind of sense of disconnect that is so palpable with that particular issue, but also what was revealed this week, the profits of those organisations. Have you seen the standard of some of the accommodation, the poor quality of the support? I don't know. To me, it's another example of the Whitehall system at its worst, that it almost says, right, we've done that, we tick that box, and we don't really see what's going on that ground. On the ground, well, that's the worst of all worlds. There must be a better way.
Okay, there's lots of questions coming through, so let me find the next one. What specifically has been done in Manchester, this is a question from Jack, that other parts of the country could learn from in terms of devolution? And can I add it to another question that's now disappeared? No, just go with that one. Let's go with that one.
I think what can we kind of share with us, and we do share everything as best we can. It's about collaboration, really. It starts with collaboration between our 10 councils, and then collaboration public and private, and then, as I've said today, with community voluntary faith. You build that way. That's been Greater Manchester's approach over many years, and other places don't have that level of cohesion. And I think you've got to work at it. You've got to see the bigger picture. You know, too often you've got councils fighting each other and arguing in quite a parochial way. Greater Manchester has managed to rise above some of that, to see the bigger picture, which is the prosperity of this place and the way we support our people. And you've got to get there to make devolution work for you. And I think you begin to see that change. So Liverpool, I mentioned, but Steve Rotherham, the mayor there, has really started to bring the Greater Manchester style, if you like. And he was in Manchester with me the other day at the university saying that's what he's done. He's tried to make Liverpool more pragmatic, more functional. And it's starting to happen. And this should give everybody hope. I think the devolved model that's spreading across England, Cheshire and Warrington are coming in from next year, is actually something of a life raft here in terms of the fairly bleak times that we're in. And once people move into those combined authorities, I think it builds a more collaborative approach, and it starts to sort of change people's perspective on things. And let's be honest, they've all looked at Greater Manchester and thought, oh my God, they're moving right ahead. We need a bit of what they're doing. And whilst there's nothing wrong with that, I'm quite proud that Greater Manchester has led that change. But everywhere can do it. It's not beyond the reach of anywhere to do the same.
Well, this was the question that had disappeared, and I wanted to kind of, thinking about those models, and that kind of social cohesion that is so important. A question from John. In recent times, we're seeing a rise in the far right, which is unnerving, particularly for vulnerable communities. How can devolution bridge society and reconcile hatred? Also, can you be PM? John says.
I think it's what I'm going back to, what I said. Devolution is about getting power closer to people, closer to places. And I think that is a big part of countering alienation and building cohesion and building connection and building a state based on, if you like, empathy, faith, compassion. And I would say that is the Greater Manchester approach. I'm not going to claim we get everything right and there's not things we need to fix. There's plenty of things we need to fix in Greater Manchester. But that is our approach. We are the only ones, through the amazing work that Ian did and others in this room, we're the only ones who tonight have a bed every night looking after 600 people in single rooms in our city region, because we have a compassion that says people shouldn't be on the streets. There are still people on the streets, but it's partly because people come to Greater Manchester because of what we try and do. And that, I think, is how devolution can change the conversation, because you start to sort of put those values back at the heart of things. But I do believe it's more than that. You have to sort of really change politics top to bottom to counter this alienation. As we look to the next election, to pick up the point about people moving to parties that are more, or views that are more on the extremes of society. To me, that says you need to change and change now and offer a more collaborative approach, in that I believe the next general election that we're heading towards will be unlike any we've faced in our lifetimes. It will not be the lineup of parties in the same way as it was, and this one, the blue one, or the red one, or the yellow one, or I don't think it'll be like that. I think, in effect, what is going to be the choice, it's almost like a rerun of the referendum of 2016. You will have that direction over there, or you can have this one over here, which reflects something more of what you've known, or you can kind of go, this is the way I see it, in a different direction that potentially takes Britain down a path that I don't think we've ever been down before, certainly not in our lifetimes. And I think you have to get ready for that now. And I think you have to kind of use the power of devolution, but beyond that, build up to a more collaborative politics at a national level and work more with those who are prepared to sort of stand together on certain issues and find points of agreement rather than points of difference. Do you know, that was a real learning for me when I became Mayor of Greater Manchester. I stood under first past the post in my last Westminster election in 2015, and I found it a really difficult election. It wasn't, you know, it was quite unhappy on the doorstep, and it wasn't a great experience. And then in 2017, I stood for the first time to be Mayor of Greater Manchester under the PR system, you know, where you could have a second preference off the, you know, people put 1, 2, 3 or whatever on their ballot paper. And you know the difference? You knock on every door in that system when it's a preferential system, because even if it's a Lib Dem person or a Green or a Conservative even, you've got an incentive to find a point of agreement with that person rather than point score against the other parties, because that second preference might be valuable to you. So finally, the conversation on the doorstep starts to align with what the public want, which is parties to work more in common to find solutions. That's what most people want from politics. But Westminster politics doesn't do it. And I had a real learning experience when I was finally talking to voters of other parties, finding where I could agree with them and what I could say to them that might give me their second preference. So to me, devolution plus a different political culture can, in my view, allow us to offer the country something that is an alternative to that darker path that I think is also opening up. And, you know, if we don't quickly get to a position where we're offering that really substantially different thing, the danger is the dark path might be the one that the country takes.
Two final questions. A question from Constance. Now that we all hope the Gaza war looks like it may be coming to an end, how do you hope to bridge the political divide between the Jewish and Muslim community in Manchester?
It's that thing about culture of encounter, but that point I was making about more collective discussion. You know, we've got some work to do, I think, in terms of a better way of having that conversation between our communities at a very grassroots level. And how do you create the spaces for that to happen in a more meaningful way, perhaps, than we've achieved before? We're proud that we have a Jewish-Muslim forum in Greater Manchester, and they do brilliant work. But how do you take that down a bit deeper? How do you take that to the younger generation? How do you just have conversations that are in that sort of, you know, collective culture of encounter and just let people hear each other's points of view? I think that is part of what we've got to do. But it's why I kind of say, you know, we need a different, more enabling state at the local level that has got the funding to do all that stuff. Councils don't have social cohesion or community cohesion funding anymore. You know, it's all been stripped back so far that they can't do it. And it's what I'm trying to say to everybody tonight. You know, repair the state at the local level so that it can do things to bring communities back together.
Thank you. It was announced last week that the next Archbishop of Canterbury will be Sarah Mullally, Bishop of London. Any words of advice for her? What would you like to see from her? Your final question.
How could I?
What would you like to see from her, from the church?
Oh my goodness. A humble altar boy from the other side. How could I offer advice to the Archbishop of Canterbury? Oh my goodness. It's obviously a hugely encouraging thing. From what I know of her, that she's been appointed, I think she's got an incredible opportunity to connect with people. I would say to her, hopefully this is not too controversial a statement, but get that Bishop of Newcastle really close to you and listen to her, because she did some brave things, I think, to speak truth to power and, you know, challenging openly when things are wrong. I've learned in my political career through Hillsborough and other things, you know, if there is injustice and there's wrong, face it fully. Don't kind of turn away from it because it's difficult or inconvenient. It's Helen, isn't it, the Bishop of Newcastle?
Helen Ann Hartley.
Yeah, I think she showed real bravery in some, and I don't think she was always thanked for it. And I had the chance to say that to her recently. I think like all institutions, the Church of England is at one of those moments, isn't it, where it needs to, if you like, face up and show it faces up, perhaps in a different way than it may have done in the past. And from that comes trust, and it's that point, isn't it? How do we build trust? But I've got great hope for Sarah in that role. Lead by example is the best thing you can do, isn't it? Always walk in others' shoes, as I'm sure she will before you make your pronouncements. Reach out in terms of your messaging. Who am I to give advice to the Archbishop of Canterbury? Anyway, you've just made me do it.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our questions. And I hope you'll agree with me that this has been a fascinating, insightful, and inspiring evening. Before we get to drinks and canapes, I wanted to say a few thank yous. First of all, to Mayor Andy Burnham for being a brilliant lecturer this evening. A huge thank you to our sponsors, CCLA. For the past 12 of our annual lectures, we've been really grateful for their support. They've proved to be really generous and thoughtful partners. And for those of you who don't know them, CCLA are the largest manager of charity funds in the UK. And they were set up over 60 years ago to serve the interests of mission-driven organisations that were not well served by the financial services industry. They do amazing work.